Right, so let's do some checklists for a basic simple house so that we can all get on the same wavelength. We all know a little bit about housing. What are the things that we need to do first? Can anyone call out something that you think you need to be checked, or the building inspector needs to check before you start pouring concrete? So the first one is identifying good ground. Let's say we're doing a slab with a perimeter beam, concrete beam, so we've got, we're going to be pouring concrete at a perimeter beam. The next one would be reinforcing, yeah? So we've got some reinforcing going on in there. We can do another whole checklist for reinforcing. So one of the first things for reinforcing is grade. Do the plans ask for high tensile steel, or do the plans ask for mild steel? I've been onto jobs where I've walked in, and there was a classic one, it used to be on TV, and I walked on and I was told by the council, go and do this inspection on this house. So I walked onto this site, and the guy his name was Coxey, passed away just recently, I think. But he was doing this house, and it was all going on TV, and they were building this house and showing everybody how to build. I walked on site, and as I walked past the foundations, which were already poured, I just shook the foundation bars which were standing up, and I knew straight away they were mild steel. And the reason I knew they were mild steel, there's two different ways of looking at steel, and it's got a very clear distinction on it. So the steel has ribs on it, and every now and then there's a rib missing. So that one is missing. And on the other side, that one's missing further up. On the plans, it said to me that the steel was D16's Y. So Y is almost stainless steel. I walked on site and I said to Coxey, where did you get the steel from? He said, oh, I've got it from Placemakers. And I said, well, you've got the wrong steel. Your plans clearly show high tensile steel, and you've put mild steel in. Tell me why I should sign that off in front of your camera here, because they had the TV camera there. Why should I sign that off when you've purposely cheated and put the wrong steel in? Well, at that point, the camera's turned off. So, reinforcing, the grade's most important. On the really big jobs, it's usually done by a company that does just nothing but reinforcing, so therefore they'll get it right, and they'll have the paperwork that goes with it. If you're buying it from Placemakers, make sure you still get the grade right, because there is two very distinct types and quality of grade reinforcing. Check the plans to make sure you've got the grade correct. Next one would be cover. Now the cover of the reinforcing is how much concrete you put around the reinforcing. So you've got reinforcing bars coming through there, and a reinforcing rod going horizontal that way. If you're in the ground, and you've got the ground is there, and you don't have a membrane, or you don't have a vapor barrier, or that measurement there is 75 millimeters. If you've got a plastic membrane, and you put a plastic membrane, you can get that down to 50 millimeters. That is important, and that's a measurement the building inspector will check. He will check, for instance, when you've got the reinforcing bars going around, he will check, and all these measurements will be shown on your plans. Where you've got the corner and the steel's coming along there, and these rods are all going along, and they've got the correct bend, and this one comes along and is bent that way. That lap is a minimum requirement. If it's 40 times the diameter, 40 12s if it's a 12mm rod, 480 we're looking for the bend, or the cover. And the same with, you've got a joint in the middle. So you've got a joint in the middle, and this rod here joins that rod, and that one goes through there, and that one stops there, and they're tied together. That lap, the overlapping of that, the building inspector will want to measure. And if it's not the minimum requirement, you can have it more, you can have a 600 lap, but if it's less than 480, he's going to knock you back. He's going to say, do it all again, fellas. So, cover of and placement. What else can I think of? Again, if you've got a slab and you've got a slab which is, so you've got the ground there, and you've got 4D12s in here, and you've got mesh. If you haven't got the steel sitting up on the correct little plastic chairs and the correct height there and the correct, so the building inspector will want to know the boxing that you've got in here, ready for that height and that string line through there, and he will want to know what cover that steel is. Just don't tell him, she'll be right, mate. Because if it's not enough and your steel hasn't got the correct cover, as Jenny will tell you, it's not going to comply and you're not going to get it passed. So very important to get all of these things right before the building inspector comes along. So good ground is one of the first things, but he'll want to see the ground before you put the plastic membrane over it. Reinforcing and the grade of reinforcing, and whether it's there's some special bars you might have a slab thickening. If it's a average house, a small house, and instead of having a full foundation, it'll just have a slab thickening in the ground, and that slab thickening might be underneath, there might be only 2 rods in there, and the mesh goes right over the top. But that spacing there and that spacing there, and that being supported down there, is very important. Don't tie these directly underneath the mesh, because it's in the wrong place. Because eventually you're going to put a partition on there and a wall with a heavy load on there. So therefore you're going to want something to hold it up. So again, checklists. Very important you have these checklists, and make sure you keep the checklists. And even if the building inspector might come along and say, have you got a checklist for whatever it is? Oh, did I rub it off too quick? Sorry. The building inspector might want you, oh no, I'll just use an example. So that very first bit there, and we're only just ticking off B, structural stability. There are 32 clauses to the building code. We're just covering number 1. And I could go on for hours on this. So can imagine how far we're going to go when we're going through 32 clauses. We've got a lot of work to do. Reinforcing and grade, cover and placement. That's about all we know. Cover and placement, there's two covers, one underneath the reinforcing, one above the reinforcing on a slab. What else? That'll do, that's a good start. As well as in the foundations checklist, you've got another one here, and it's the plumber. Because he'll be wanting to put some pipe work throughout that slab. Drainage for your toilets wastes, your basin wastes, your kitchen wastes. He'll want to be putting the... So he'll have his own checklist. And his own checklist will be the quality of the pipe that goes in underground is a higher quality than the one that goes in the wall, because it's under the ground. So he'll want to know, he'll have his own separate checklist. And then you've got to have the correct bend in place. You can't have a right angle bend because you don't want it to block. You've got to have the correct fall, because if the pipe doesn't go downhill, well then there's no point in the water sitting in the pipe going nowhere. You're going to have a blockage. So you're going to have the correct fall. So the plumber's going to have his own separate checklist. We haven't got even out of the foundations yet. So then there's the slab. Let's go on to timber framing, and there's a lot of things. And I meant to go and get my moisture meter. Has everyone seen a moisture meter? No, it's all right. It's not in the car. It's at home in the garage. I forgot to bring it. I forgot to bring the darn thing. I meant to bring the moisture meter, because we could do a whole session on moisture meters. So let's go into some framing. But you can every job is different. So I can't really write out one list that covers everybody's job. Foundation, the first thing you'll need for this foundations check, the very, very first thing you need is the important one I was talking about up here. Surveyor. Has the surveyor set the house out correctly? Has he found your boundary pegs? Do you know exactly where it's going to go? I could give you numerous examples of turning up on a site, they didn't have a survey peg, and I refused them to allow them to pour. Well, I refused to accept it until we had the surveyor's certificate. And I know of a number of people who got caught out, particularly in rural areas, not so much if you're doing a residential house where everything's been built and finished for quite some time. But you still need a surveyor certificate. And the reason you need a surveyor certificate, if you're doing a house and you've got a house built and you're doing a piece out the side, the distance from that boundary is quite crucial to whether you're going, you might have 1 metre in there. How does the building inspector know if that fence is being built onto the boundary or not? How does he know? He can take a guess and say, oh, well, it's been there for a long time. Or he can say, provide me with a survey peg. There's a number of different reasons why you need that metre is critical. Any closer than 1 metre, you need to be fully fire rated wall. And when I look at the plans, it's not a fire rated wall. So therefore I know that it's got to be 1 metre and 1 millimetre away from the boundary. Show me the boundary pegs. So that is probably one of the most important people to get in. We use them on site. We used to have our own surveyor who did nothing but survey things on site all the time. So the plumber will have his own checklist for the plumber or the drain layer, most of them do both, for everything that goes under the ground, under the slab. Reinforcing, cover, placement, reinforcing. Okay, framing. So one of the first things I can think of is the grade. Is it number 1 framing grade? Is it number 2 framing grade? What are the requirements under 3604? There is a section in 3604, and you've probably all seen this document. This document here is the document you'll use for standard house building. Everybody calls it the building code. It is not, because you can use an English version, or you can use an American version, or you can use an Australian version, or you can build a straw bale house. You won't get any of the design out of this book. As long as the straw bale house complies with the minimum requirements of the Building Act and the Building Code for insulation, for health, for safety, for welfare, then it complies. You don't necessarily have to build a timber frame house. You can build steel frame. And they're bringing in regulations now to make it easier for steel frame, particularly for the Kiwi build, I notice. But there's a whole section in here on the cladding systems, on ceiling. I'll just see if I can find it. On the grade of timber that you're going to use. Walls and grading, and it's all about whether it's an SG10 or an SG8 or an SG, whatever system you're going to use. But it's all throughout this book of NZS 3604. You'll get your sizes, you'll get the timber framing sizes. I haven't got time to go through all of that. It's a whole separate discussion all on its own. So the framing, and it's the grade. Another one is moisture content. And follow, if you are building out of this book, which is the most common book, then follow exactly what it's got in that book, and you can't go wrong, because this is the book that's been accepted by Ministry of Building and Housing. Make sure you get the lintels. If you've got a framing for the lintels for the windows, and in high wind zone, in that book there it tells you you've got to strap them down, the lintels strapped down, right down through to the floor. Make sure when you've got bracing, when you've got separate bracing on the separate walls, wherever you've got framing, follow the plan, and if it says put a brace there of a particular style, put it there. Don't just say to the building inspector, nah, she'll be right, no, we don't need that, because he's not going to accept it. So I could write a whole separate checklist on just framing as you work through a house. So probably you should get hold of a set of drawings. See if you can get hold of the drawings wherever you're working, if you can get a copy of the drawings. Sit down and start thinking about it and writing a checklist. It's good practice as you go on to think of all the things. And then at the end of the job, sit down and work out, did I get that right? Did I think about this? Even if you're not the lead person on the site, doesn't matter. See if you can walk around and listen to the building inspector, listen to the lead guy, see if you can spend a bit of time with them. You'll pick up a lot of information that you didn't necessarily get by looking at the plans. What else? Framing. So that's effectively pre-lining framing. Then we can go into a post-lining framing. Post-lining framing, I probably should have taken the photo. Post-line, we're looking at things like, once the jib board's on the walls, we're looking at the number of fixings that hold that brace together. And as an example, this is not the book I want. So there's an easy brace. This is an easy brace book from Winston's. You can pick these up from Winston's. They're a free handout. But in here it tells you, and Winston's have some very good booklets on site guide, on fire rating, on Aqualine, on Braceline. They've got all the different books for the different systems. Be very careful of when it shows you a sheet of jibboard and it clearly shows 50 mils up and 50 mils in is where the first fixing is. And the fixings are 150 centres. I have been to so many building sites and the first fixing I see is there. When clearly in Winston's book it says 50 millimetres and 50 millimetres. That fixing there will break out of when the sheet's working hard under high wind zone or an earthquake, that'll just break out of there and it's useless. So the first thing I'll look at and I'll say, now you can take it all apart and do it again properly because you haven't complied with the manufacturer's specification. It's not a New Zealand standard, it's not the Building Act, but it's a minimum requirement from a manufacturer to comply with his system. Then he can sign it off and say, yep, that system is compliant. Now I can hand that document to the building inspector and he can give me a code compliance certificate. So the paperwork is very important to get the system through and keeping very, very good documentation. Can't stress that enough. Be careful of fixings. You might have a totally different type of bracing system that's being used. It might be quite specific and special. It might be a system that's imported. Follow the system accurately. Make sure you've got a copy on the plan on the site so that when the building inspector turns up, he can look at that and say, well, that's okay because it's exactly like that. It might be that it's a straw bale house, and straw bale houses were being built. Haven't seen one lately, but I do know of straw bale houses. You don't use those systems, but the manufacturer of that product has all of those systems set up in a booklet. It's part of the specification. Keep it on site. So post lining. Fixings to the manufacturer's detail. Again, up here we probably should have moisture content. What else can I think of? Make sure the plumber hasn't put pipework throughout the brace where the braces are, because it negates the brace. No point in having a nice big flash brace with fixings all around, and then the plumber comes and puts a big hole in there. It's then useless, doesn't work. Now, the ways around that are, if you've got another stud central and that system there becomes part of the brace, as long as that's a minimum requirement, then maybe this doesn't matter. Maybe that the whole wall, say you've got a big long wall and you've got 10 sheets of jibboard in there, 5 sheets of jibboard, whatever, it doesn't matter. Only one of them needed to be the brace. You might have only needed a 1.2 sheet as the brace. Instead of putting it there, it can go there because that's outside the brace. So this becomes negated through here and we can make sure our brace is in this bit. Make sure the lady of the house doesn't come along and say, oh, I want a window in here now, because that's just going to wreck the brace. So exempt buildings, the exempt building book I had here earlier, which allows you to exempt things. You can take a wall down inside your house, but it cannot be a load-bearing wall. A load-bearing wall is a braced wall. You can't take them out. Okay, final inspections. So the final inspections, and the building inspector can look at just about any one of these clauses on this page. So if you have a look at these, there are 32 clauses here. Each clause has a different meaning. And have you all got a copy of this? Yeah. So each one has a different, the stability. Stability is one of the key ones. Stability is the structural stability. B1 structure is one of the key ones. The protection from fire doesn't really affect residential houses as long as you're away from the boundary, and that should have been sorted out by the architect before you even got on site. D1 access, go down to D1 access. D1 access has all sorts of things in it, from how high the handrail is, how steep are the stairs, whether you need nosing strips. There's a lot of information in D1 that's applying to residential houses and commercial. Moisture. Moisture is about the water getting into the building, and moisture is about whether it's rising up from the ground underneath the slab to whether it's penetrating from the outside. There's a huge amount of moisture. Each one of these we could spend a whole subject on. Surface water is another one. Final inspection will deal with surface water, because the surface water, we don't want water from the neighbours or from the road or anywhere else coming into our section and flooding into our front door. So surface water is another one here. External moisture. The building inspector will look at all of the cladding on the outside to make sure there's no holes, gaps that you've got. Scribers on the windows if you have to have them. Flashings are in the right place. Flashings on the roof. There is a huge amount in there. You won't need to use the hazardous building substances. Safety from falling is where you need a barrier. You need a barrier at the edge of your deck, or you need a barrier where people can fall more than a metre outside of the building envelope. You'll need a barrier. You'll get that out of safety from falling. Warning systems and signs and visibility, that's all to do with commercial buildings. Personal hygiene, that's all your toilets, your showers, your extract fan for your oven, all of that sort of thing. That's all part of dealing with a house. Ventilation, do the windows open? Have you got the correct width of windows and the amount of opening space to get an amount of fresh air for the occupants of the building? That goes all the way back to the very first thing I put on the board is health, safety, welfare of the occupants. This clause deals with it. Natural light is another one. Is the window big enough? Do you get enough natural light? And we can go right through almost every clause of this building code, and the building code is 3 books that thick, and there's pages and pages and pages of it. That's a taster of the inspector's job. And I'm just about done.
You can ask some questions.
Yeah.
Almost, yeah. If I need 10 minutes, I'm all finished.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see that I've covered as much as I can in the space of time, and I've tried to stick with just the perimeter, the outside peripheral part of where the inspector is going to come from, what an inspector's job is. We delve down into the detail and we use it a lot more, and we have to carry a lot of this information in our head. Go back to, where's my conclusions? Yeah, can you go back to the conclusions? No, next one down. The last one.
This one?
Yeah. Just.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, that's all. Come here.
Okay. Right. So don't forget the inspector. He's got to sign it off. If you forget the inspector, then you've got a problem. You won't get occupation. That's a critical part. Good documentation. I can't stress enough that you need to get really, really good documentation. You guys are lucky. You've got cameras now that can take a photo. In the old days, I never had a camera. And I used to have to sit and write little reports. And I tell you what, one photo is worth 1,000 words. One photo of the ground conditions before you poured the concrete, taking 2 or 3 photos of your site, best thing you could do, keep them as a record. Same with the framing, same with the jib bracing, same with all of the parts that you do. Get some good documentation. Keeping it in a logical order is all about making sure, don't have a whole lot of photos and the first one you see is the front door lock or we don't want to know that. The first one I want to see is the ground conditions. Keep it in a logical order of how you built it. Build it in your head. Because if you don't get a code compliance certificate, you're not going to get occupation. You can't sell a house until you've got a code compliance certificate. The lawyers can't do that. There are ways and means around it, but generally speaking, no CCC means you're not going to get paid. So, some questions. Any questions about where I'm going with this generally? I had a couple of questions from the guys up there, really. What I might do is...
He asked
Before we submit the document to the council will give us a list of what kind of document we should submit?
It should be on your conditions of the building consent, and you should try and do your own list. Yes, the council officer will have a list of things that he'll ask for. Be very careful of that, because some council officers will ask for things that are not on your building consent. And then you've got a heck of a job trying to provide something that actually was never required.
Can we reject it?
You can, he might not. Because once he's got it in his tablet, it's really hard to get rid of it. So you're best to try and produce your own list. Sit down with the building inspector and say, well, I've got this, and I've got all these documents. Here's the one for the membrane we put under the floor. Here's the one for the waterproofing of the roof. Here's the one for the cladding on the outside. Here's the one for the structural beam.
You mean this is in the final inspection?
This is in the final inspection.
Part.
Yep.
You show all your documents.
Yes. Keep your documents in good logical order, but make sure you get... And if he sees that, he's going to be much more impressed. And he's going to be a lot easier on you than if you've got nothing.
For example,
If he's not there to write the list out for you. He's not actually there to work for you. You need to be able to do some of that yourself and do all the basics. But the first thing you need to do, look at the conditions of your building consent. If it says in the conditions you need to provide a producer statement from the engineer, try and have it ready for. At least if you can say to him, I've got the engineer coming, he's been on site, I'm just waiting for his report, he's promised it next Tuesday.
Okay.
You know, be as open as you can with the building inspector.
So what about if, for example, if you're doing the framing part and you forgot to do the moisture content, and when the gable is on, the painting is down?
Then you've got a problem. Because the building inspector, the building inspector could insist that you remove. I've done it. I've taken the architraves off around the door. I've taken the skirting scotia off, and I've tested the moisture content. And if it didn't pass, take it all off. Take it all off. Start again. At the end of the day, why should I, as a building inspector, sign off on your workmanship when I've never been given the chance to inspect it?
Yeah, I understand that.
You see how that's where the inspectors are.
There is a real case here. A single-storey house.
Yep. Sorry.
Garage and rental, got a 3 speed.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the builder forgot the inspection.
Right.
Now, when they apply for CCC, the council asking for DS4.
And how are you going to get that when nobody's ever seen it?
Yeah. My question is, what's the liability of council for the officer not mentioning to the builder? You need a rank engineer to do inspection and education.
Okay. Okay, the question is, it's private residential house, 2-storey? Okay. So we've got a house with a double garage, a 2-storey house. Whatever, garage down there. So we've got a big beam across here. That's supported on posts down there, whatever it does. So this is obviously carrying load from up on this floor, right? If that span's overspanned and the engineer has designed a particular beam to go there, the question is, did the engineer inspect it? If he hasn't, he's not going to give you a PS4. If the building inspector's never seen it, the building inspector's not going to sign it off after.
Auckland Council inspector did a pre-line inspection.
And he passed the pre-line inspection. Did, okay, was the PS4 part of the conditions of the original building consent request? It was. So it was on the conditions. Therefore the owner knew about it and the builder knew about it. The building inspector should have mentioned it in passing, but because it was on the conditions and because it was on the issued building consent, the council cannot legally issue the CCC until they've got that.
Building inspector on site wasn't mentioning that issue to the builder. What's the liability of council on site?
Probably none, because the council put it on the building consent. Now, if it wasn't on the building consent, and then the building inspector is asking for a PS4, that's a whole different story. So,
the building inspector on site, the builder asked, have you engineered design? Have you got an inspection? The building inspector didn't ask.
what the building inspector should have done is refuse any further work at the pre-line stage or the post line. When they first noticed that the beam was there and he ticked the box, he should have said, until I get the PS4, you can't line anything. Now the trouble is with that is, most of the time the PS4 comes in at the end of the job. So you'd be waiting forever. So there's a bit of a...
What's the way around it?
What's the way around it? Then I would be removing the jib board on the inside, particularly around that area and around that area. And then I would be removing a patch of jib board to see the connection between the post and beam. Was it a timber beam or was it a steel beam? Timber, so a double or a triple lintel. Yeah, or one of those special, what do they call them? Oh, I've forgotten the name. There is a beam you can get which is which can exceed 3604. It's a manufactured one. Yeah, you could put a flitch beam in there. So the flitch beam is the two pieces of timber, a steel plate, and another piece of timber there. And the bolts through there are staggered. The bolts are all staggered through the flitch beam, and that's a piece of steel. That's a piece of steel in there, and that piece of steel and the piece of timber clamps it all together. So the pre-nail company supplied it already built and made up, so it only had to be lifted in. Okay, so the next question is, what's the support under here, and did it need 2 or did it need 3 studs? So, and the next question is, they quite often want the timber framing to go right up there as stability to stop that twisting. So those two studs there, that's what the building inspector should have seen, or the engineer. And if there was a condition on the building consent to provide a PS4, which is a bit heavy for a residential house, but if there was a condition there, because really any building inspector can sign that off. But if they didn't, then it's up to the owner to read the conditions, it's up to the builder to read the conditions to make sure that gets done.
If the client engaged a structural engineer to write a report regarding that issue,
Then
that report will be based on the evidence of the thing,
yep,
green element, right?
yes,
And then the TN3 from Carpenter,
yes, yes,
with the insurance system.
yes,
Also based on, in the past, working relationship with that particular builder.
builder,
And the engineer write a report saying,
Yep.
there is no reason that builder not building that thing
yes.
without any connections.
And then I would, if,
The council will accept it.
yeah, and then the council would probably accept that. And I wouldn't have a problem with that too. If you got a report from the structural engineer, you had evidence that it was supplied by a manufacturer who normally supplied those things. If it was just built by Joe Bloggs, the next door neighbour, I wouldn't accept it. But if it was supplied by a manufacturer who knew what they were doing and has done them in the past and they'd been accepted in the past, then I would accept that. In lieu of a full PS4. Because really what you're doing is providing almost a PS4 anyway, because your letter from your engineer is like a PS4. The PS4 covers, has a insurance indemnity against it. PS3s don't. Yeah.
So you need that report equivalent.
Equivalent to. Now the council may or may not accept that. Because, as I said right at the beginning, producer statements are not actually mentioned in the Building Act. And although council has them all on their website and says you must use these forms, they're not actually legal documentation in front of the Building Act anyway. So therefore, the council's using the letter from the engineer as if it were a PS4.
On this particular case, there is a form that can sign up, which is engaged. The only engaged engineer to carry out
Inspections. Yeah.
Let's go on the inside of the form.
Ah,
So that means no PS4 not
yeah,
by law.
yeah, yeah. And the council would eventually have to come down to accepting that. If they never accepted the form in the first place where it says producer statements shall be supplied by the owner, if the owner had signed that and the council had a copy of that, the council could just sit on their hands and say, no, we don't accept it. But because that document isn't alive, then the council would probably accept a letter from the engineer with backup from manufacturer and a PS3 from the installer. And as long as that person had a history that can be backtracked and they've had no problems in the past, then the council probably is going to accept it eventually. Yeah. But she'll be right won't work. Are we finished? Okay, any further questions? I'm just about finished. I've done my dash here. I hope you found it interesting. And I hope you got something out of it. Having been a building inspector and you've been on the other side, I'm not the enemy. I'm there to help. Building inspectors are there to help. There's some very good building inspectors out there. One or two of them, we had a particularly difficult man up in Paramaribo, but so be it. That's as it is. Anyway, hope you all got something from that. Thank you for your time.